Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you by Spectator TV and broadcast on Thursday, 31st of March. I'm Katy Balls, the Spectator's Deputy Political Editor, and I'll be your host this week. On this week's show, Joe Biden said that Putin cannot remain in power. But then the White House backtracked. Is the American president really advocating for regime change in Moscow? Matt Purple, who writes this week's cover piece, will be on the show with Freddy Gray. It comes as Russian and Ukrainian delegations are negotiating a peace deal, or at least trying to. What's the latest, and will Putin stick to any agreement? I'll be joined by former State Department official Michael Kimmage. The Metropolitan Police have issued 20 fines into their investigations into parties in Downing Street. But has the sting been taken out of the row? James Forsyth and Isabel Hardman will be on the show to discuss and give us an update on the mood amongst Tory MPs. Richard Florida writes in this week's magazine that after 2 years, cities are back. He'll be on the show with the Spectator's business editor, Martin Vander Weyer. And finally, as energy prices soar, Lionel Shriver says she never turns the heating on anyway. Lionel will join me to discuss and offer some tips. Before we get going, a very special thank you to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management, who are sponsoring the Week in 60 Minutes. Canaccord are experienced wealth planners and investment managers who go above and beyond to offer you support and guidance. Just visit candowealth.com to find out more. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel too. Click the red subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss an episode. Joe Biden this week said that Vladimir Putin cannot remain in power, prompting speculation that the American president was going to push for regime change in Moscow. However, the White House, or at least those working for Joe Biden, have other ideas and quickly suggested that was not the case. In this week's cover piece, Matt Purple asked whether the American president knows what he's doing. Matt joins me now alongside Freddy Gray, the Spectator's deputy editor and host of the Americano podcast. Matt, Freddy, thanks for joining. Matt, in your cover piece, you say that Biden's comments ultimately encapsulate his whole approach. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, I think that there is no Biden without gaffes, right? And I don't even think that's that controversial a statement to make. I think he would probably admit as much. I think that he said himself that I am a gaffe machine, and fair credit where it's due for admitting his flaws and his weaknesses. But yeah, I think Biden's approach so far has actually been rather shrewd. It's been careful, it's been cautious, it's been condemning of the Russians, but also understanding that this could get much worse, applying a little imagination, understanding the stakes could be nuclear here. But then there's always the issue, there's always the peril that he's going to come out and he's going to say something that's going to completely undermine that. And I actually don't think that the remark that he made when he was in Poland was that terrible. I mean, I've wondered myself whether or not this is going to end without Putin being removed from within. It's certainly a sensible thing to think about, but it's that old problem. You couple that with all the other gaffes he's made, even just over the past week. It's that old problem of whether or not there can be a coherent policy from the Biden administration without him taking the shotgun and aiming it at his own foot.
Freddie, did you manage to see the merits of that comment?
Well, I did. I found it a little bit odd, sort of some of the reactions to Biden's various gaffes. It wasn't just the regime change gaffe, it was the remark to the 82nd Airborne telling them they when they go into Ukraine, suggesting that the US would deploy troops. And it was also the respond in kind about chemical weapons, which, as Matt says in his piece, his brilliant piece, says, suggested the US might be willing to unleash sarin gas all over Eastern Europe. I thought it was a bit odd in some of the reactions that people said, he just says what everybody thinks. And I don't think that's right. I mean, I don't think the leader of the free world, the president of the United States, should just say whatever he thinks. I think that's for idiot journalists like me. I think it's unhealthy to have a gaffe machine president. However, he sort of gets away with it because everybody assumes that there's a competent machine behind him. And again, as Matt suggests, it does seem at the moment as though the Biden machine is working quite well.
Matt, do you agree with what Freddie says there? I mean, ultimately, in the cons of having a gaffe-prone president, the fact that the White House had to quite quickly seem to contradict the person who's supposed to be in charge of the White House, given this is pretty high stakes, we're in a war.
Yeah, I think so. And I think all our last four presidents have all been gaffe prone to one extent or another. It's almost a qualification for the job at this point. But they've been gaffe prone in different ways. And with Biden, I think it's there's a fair amount of clever thinking that goes into it. There's a fair amount of preparation by his underlings to set a coherent policy that then get undermined. Whereas with Trump, it was just more chaotic, kind of back and forth. With Bush, it was, just these awkward, Bushisms that would come out of his mouth. So, but I also take Freddie's point, look, diplomatic niceties are very important. The world of diplomacy is a very sensitive, a very careful one, and words matter, and they matter a lot. I mean, these are the kinds of people at the State Department, for example, who stressed about the slightest little adverb or the slightest article in the smallest sentence. It really is vital that you get the language right. And I'm sure that Biden has caused a lot of internal headaches. Now, I don't think it's been that big a deal so far, because when he said respond in kind, I think everybody understood that was just Biden going off the cuff and misspeaking like he sometimes does. I don't think anybody thought that we were going to be, coating Eastern Europe with gas anytime soon. But I do still think that the possibility exists that he could say something far worse and far more undermining, and that could cause us some serious problems down the road.
Now, Freddie, if we look at Biden's general approach on Ukraine, Matt says in his piece that ultimately actually it could be described as strikingly sensible if we put the gaffes aside and focus on what America's been doing, working with allies. Do you agree with that?
I think America has been quite sensible so far. I think if you look historically, America's approach to Ukraine has not worked very well. I mean, the fact that there's a war there at the moment and that America has had so much involvement and put so much investment into Ukraine, and yet it has not been enough to stop a Russian invasion and to stop a war, suggests that America has failed. But that's not down to Biden necessarily, although we do have to go back to 2014, where Biden was hugely involved in the effort to sort of establish America's national interest in the Ukraine, and to make it clear to Putin that Ukraine was not his turf. I think that policy has failed, and Biden should take some blame for it. In recent weeks, however, I think the approach of the administration does seem to have been pretty sensible. There was the publicising of intelligence, which people have different views about, but it seems to have wrong-footed Putin to a certain extent, but again wasn't enough to stop the invasion. There was also the MiG handover question with Poland, which Matt touches on in his piece, where Poland sort of wanted to hand MiG fighter jets to Ukraine through America, which would have seemed to be a fairly major act of aggression on America's part, and Biden stopped that. I think he saw what a dangerous escalation that could be. So yes, I think Biden, the administration, is handling this crisis quite sensibly so far. But the danger, of course, as we've already said, is that Biden, the man, says something very, very dangerous. And it's worth noting, going back to what Matt says, that one of his campaign slogans in 2020 was "Words have consequences," because he was presenting himself as the anti-Trump. But really, he's a continuation of Trump in terms of just gabbing off.
And I want to talk about Biden's position more generally, but just before we do that, Matt, I wondered, on that point that Freddie just touched on, and you were talking about how both Donald Trump and Joe Biden are gaffe-prone politicians, is the fact that Joe Biden is more, relaxed about relying on the rest of the administration, relying on that knowledge than Trump was. For example, I recently had Donald Trump's former Russia advisor, Fiona Hill, on my podcast, Women with Balls, and she was effectively saying trying to give Donald Trump advice on Russia was pretty much impossible. So is the fact you have a politician that, yes, may make plenty of gaffes, but will listen, meaning that he is in a different position and he's able to build ties and work with other countries in a way perhaps Trump wouldn't have?
Yeah, I think he can, and I think some of that actually comes from Biden himself. He is an internationalist. He is a multilateralist. He believes in assembling coalitions of nations and then, kind of stopping at the water's edge, making sure they don't go too far, go to war. So I think some of that is actually coming from the top. And again, that's a bit of credit to Biden in his case. But you also have to remember, too, that sometimes the bureaucracy, the underlings, can go further than the president even wants to go. And one of the reasons we've talked about the disparity between 2014 and today, one of the reasons why the policy became so pro-Ukraine, so pro-Maidan Revolution back in 2014, was that you had bureaucrats like Victoria Nuland at the State Department who were running around Kyiv, handing out sandwiches to demonstrators, making it very clear that America supported what was ultimately the overthrowing of the government there. And maybe that was the right position to take, but clearly Russia interpreted that as a threat. They invaded Crimea very quickly afterwards. That was, I think, even less Obama than it was some of the people who were under him. And so because the bureaucracy is so thick in America, sometimes it becomes autonomous, and you can end up, the commands don't always get all the way down the chain. So it really just depends on who's in charge. And we saw the peril of that before. In this case, I think it's more, I think there's a fair amount of unity throughout the government. It's just a matter, in fact, we learned that the MiG jets didn't go to Ukraine because Biden had been told by his advisors there could be real difficulties, and he sided with them. So there's that moment of harmony there. I think with Biden, it's more an issue of the advisors have to rush in and clean up his verbal flubs, and that could become a problem.
Now, Freddie, there's been, I think, a reasonable amount of praise of Biden so far on Spectator TV, but yet if you look at his poll ratings in America, they're not particularly positive. In fact, they seem to be on the decline. So what do you think's behind that? Is it anything to do with foreign affairs? Is it due to inflation? What's driving it?
First of all, Katie, can I congratulate you on getting that seamless plug for women with balls
Thank you very
into
much.
your questions. Secondly, on Biden's approval ratings, yes, they are hitting new lows. Inflation is a real problem. This administration has struggled to grapple with most crises. I'd say the Ukraine crisis so far, and again, you've got to stress so far, has been the one issue it's handled reasonably competently. So I think Biden is in deep trouble. In the midterms, it still looks as though he's going to get a shellacking, to use the Obama term. And there is no clear Democratic leadership alternative. Kamala Harris is even less popular, and I think everybody knows what a disaster she is now. And there are no other good options for the Democrats at the moment, viable or realistic options, that is. So the Democrats are in big trouble. Joe Biden's presidency is still in big trouble. If he can have some sort of savior of the free world moment, it's possible he could reinvent himself. But then you have to come back to what we're talking about here, which is his silly mouth.
And just briefly on that, Freddie, it's interesting, this idea of perhaps a Ukraine bounce, because when we're looking at the situation in the UK, there's lots of figures around Boris Johnson, supporters of Boris Johnson, who think that Ukraine is effectively helping him with some of his domestic troubles. But again, when you look at the personal approval ratings, it doesn't feel yet, though, despite praise, I think, domestically, both for Joe Biden and Boris Johnson, that this is changing voters' opinions of the politician more generally. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's fascinating, isn't it, that Vladimir Putin sort of gave an amazing gift or opportunity to the leaders that hate him most, or that have most publicly opposed him on the world stage, by giving them an opportunity to elevate themselves in public opinion by condemning him. And yet the polls suggest that the public isn't quite as moved as perhaps the Westminster bubble, for want of a better term, is.
And Matt, I wondered, when you look at Biden's numbers, it doesn't feel as though they started to fall around the time of Afghanistan. So do you think mishandling or the fallout from that decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, which perhaps looked as though it would be popular on paper, has impacted how US voters view Joe Biden?
I think the withdrawal from Afghanistan didn't help because it was done sloppily, but I think that really, I'm a big skeptic of so-called foreign policy presidents. I think George W. Bush learned this the hard way. He ran so hard on Iraq and the war on terror, and by the time 2006 came around, gas prices were going up, the economy was dipping, and that he paid the price, right, at the midterm elections that year and later on in 2008 after the recession. Biden is trying now to take a foreign policy crisis, I think, and use it to mask the difficulties he's having domestically. So he's calling, for example, the price of rising gasoline here in the United States, he's calling that the Putin price hike. But everybody knows that gas prices have been going up for the better part of a year now. It's not credible. Like, it doesn't strike anybody as credible. Inflation is a very big deal. The price of food is going up. The price of household goods are going up. Even during a time of economic recovery, that can really sap whatever rise you might see in your paycheck. So I think all of that ultimately is going to supersede Ukraine because, you can turn on the news, you can watch CNN, you can watch the horrific images that are being beamed into our homes, but ultimately people feel it in their pocketbooks first. And foreign policy can become a kind of, I hate to call it a luxury item, but it can feel that way for voters, right? If it's something they care about primarily if their own needs are taken care of. And right now that's not the case here in the United States. And I think that's why Biden's approval ratings are still so low.
And finally, Matt, where does this leave this much talked about pivot to China in terms of US foreign policy? You just spoke about how voters obviously will have their priorities in terms of their day-to-day lives. It seems as though Biden, clearly there's still issues in Afghanistan, but also a lot of time now on Ukraine and Russia. Do you think that's going to have to take a backseat?
Yeah, I mean, we've been trying to do this pivot to Asia since about 2009. It's looked like one of those cartoon characters who can't stop slipping over banana peels and upending rakes into his own face. I mean, first it was Libya distracted us, then Syria distracted us, then the Trump administration. It's just been a whole really difficult process to handle. And I think that the question now is less on America than it is on China and how China is going to handle this specifically. And they've verbally been at least somewhat supportive of Russia, but there's clear indications that they're not happy about this. And they are really the center of gravity in the East right now, not Russia. So it will be, I think, curious to see how they handle this. My sense is that the Russia issue is still a more short to medium term one, whereas China is still going to be the rising threat, the real matter that we have to deal with in the 21st century, geopolitical matter. But we'll see. I also don't think it's fair to say, for example, that because Russia invaded Ukraine, that China is automatically going to invade Taiwan, for example. They're very different situations. China is much more cautious overall. So they're two different challenges, I think. But yeah, it's that old pivot to Asia, and it just keeps getting, gridlocked by reality, I suppose.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Freddie. And if you want to listen to Freddie's Americano podcast, it's on all the usual podcast platforms or at spectator.co.uk/Americano. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has stalled, and negotiating teams from the two countries are meeting in Turkey to try and hammer out a peace settlement. Putin has also said that his forces will scale down the military activity around Kiev during the negotiations. Is the end of the war in sight, or is this all part of a larger ploy from the Russian leader? I'm joined now by Michael Kimmage, an official in the US State Department from 2014 to 16, who worked on the Russia-Ukraine portfolio. Michael, thanks for joining us on Spectator TV. Now, there's lots of talk of peace talks this week between Ukraine and Russia. Can we take Putin seriously?
I think we have to take Putin seriously because, of course, he's in many ways the primary actor in this drama. So what happens militarily in Ukraine on the Russian side is entirely up to Putin. So seriously, we certainly have to take him, but his position in terms of the war itself and in terms of negotiations is extremely unclear at the moment.
On that, I wonder, could you run us through what appear to be the opening positions of both Russia and Ukraine?
Well, the Russian positions have shifted somewhat over time. The war began with maximalist efforts on the part of Russia to so-called denazify Ukraine and to demilitarize the country. That sounded like regime change or occupation of the entire country. Obviously, the war has gone much too poorly for Putin for that to be conceivable now. So what Russia is pushing for is some version of neutrality. And then it's again unclear what Putin wishes to do with the territory that his soldiers have occupied. I think that's just an ongoing part of the negotiations. Ukraine clearly wants to put an end to the war for all kinds of practical and humanitarian reasons, and it wants to preserve as much of its independence and sovereignty as it can in the negotiations. So the positions are not at all close together at the moment, and it's going to be, I'm afraid, a long process.
I suppose this is $1 million question, but where do you think perhaps a compromise or both sides could find some type of deal that they could agree to?
I don't think that the difficulty is going to be on this question of neutrality or NATO membership. I think there's an achievable compromise. What Ukraine wants not from Russia, but from Europe and the United States is a security guarantee. That's a pretty big step for the US and Europe to take. Maybe that's a step that could be taken. That would certainly allow Ukraine to feel much more self-confident in these negotiations, but that's far from a done deal. I think this most difficult part of the negotiations, and that's why I suspect they're going to drag on for quite a while, has to do with questions of territory. Russia's not going to hand back Crimea. It's going to want to occupy parts of eastern Ukraine. That's a very bitter pill for Ukraine to swallow. So I think that that will be worked out not over weeks, but over months, depending also on how things continue to go on the battlefield.
And clearly the war is not going as Putin planned. If you look at the fact it's taken them so long so far, there's not been success in terms of taking territory, as was talked at in the beginning, in terms of the Russian side. But does Putin ultimately need something he can sell as a win for there to be any agreement?
Oh, certainly. And Putin retains a number of escalatory options. He could be taking a pause before a new offensive begins in eastern Ukraine. He could be using more air power in the future. It's not at all sure that Putin is winding the war down on the Russian side. So certainly he's not going to surrender or retreat or leave without getting significant concessions from Ukraine. It's far beyond optics of needing to make a sort of face-saving move for the Russian people. I think Putin still believes he can get quite a bit out of Ukraine, and that's what he's going to try to do.
And we've seen the Ukrainians ultimately believing that they are having success in pushing back Russian forces. So were President Zelensky to agree to a deal which perhaps ceded some land that's not currently in control of Russia to Russia, as in before the war, do you think he could sell that to his people? There's some talk of, for example, the referendum before anything is agreed.
It's difficult for Zelensky. Nobody quite knows how well things are going for Ukraine. Certainly much better than most expected, much worse than Russia expected things to go militarily. But we don't know how exhausted Ukrainian troops are. We don't know the extent of losses of materiel. And, we don't quite know how difficult things are on the Ukrainian side. That's, of course, what Zelensky does know. And that's probably what's pushing him to negotiate. But he has mobilized the Ukrainian population so successfully in the course of the war that is now a bit of a diplomatic or political problem for him, that people would want to march forward toward victory. I think Zelensky doesn't believe that full victory is possible, so he's going to have to negotiate with his own population at the same time that he negotiates with Putin. It's not an easy job by any means.
Yes, exactly. And I think the rhetoric for Zelensky, but also some Western allies in terms of what this needs to mean for Ukraine. We have Boris Johnson saying Putin must fail, does suggest actually the stakes could be raised to a point that makes it hard for it to be something Russia could sell as a win. What role do you think Western allies are going to play in terms of bringing Ukraine to an agreement?
Well, I think Western allies have done a lot already for Ukraine. So this is not a story of failure. I think it's a story of gradual success. You, of course, had the enormous sanctions that have been levied on Russia, and you have a very rapid effort on the part of the UK, the US, and a number of continental European countries to assist the Ukrainian military. That's been a big part of the war, and it's taken Ukraine really quite far. I think beyond that, if I understand the position correctly in Washington, and I think it's similar in Europe, I think that the idea is just to give Zelensky as much encouragement as possible. If he wants to continue with the war, if he feels that that's necessary, that will be supported. If Zelensky needs to come to the table, make certain concessions, get a provisional peace with Putin, that too will be supported. So I think it's really not a hard and fast position on the part of the transatlantic alliance. It's a position of maximal support for Zelensky himself.
Now, you spoke earlier about how the fact it's quite hard to read the intentions of Putin and what Russia wants to get out of these negotiations, whether they're taking them seriously, whether actually it's to buy them time in terms of re-strategizing. And there are also reports this week of a poisoning at the peace talks in the form of Roman Abramovich and potentially those on the Ukrainian side. Now, there's lots of theories going around. As ever, nothing is quite verified, but I wondered if there has been a poisoning and that has affected even on the Russian side negotiating. Does that tell us anything? Could that be a warning from the Kremlin?
Well, if it's true, I mean, it's just a sign of real insanity on the Russian side to do something like that in the midst of negotiations. If it's true, and there have been a few qualifications offered to that story in the last 48 hours, it would suggest that Russia is completely unserious about achieving a diplomatic result. That they're going to continue on with the war. They're going to be pushing refugees into EU and NATO member states. They're going to exploit the crisis for whatever they can exploit it for, and they may think that they're winning on their side. So, if they're that unserious about the negotiations, that's a very bad sign. But I'm not quite sure that that's the case. I think there might be incentives on the Russian side, not just for a pause, but for an actual deal, I just think it's going to be convoluted and difficult, and quite a while before we reach that point of a real settlement.
And what do you think the incentives are for the Russians? Ultimately, I mean, we're hearing reports, and as with everything, there's different figures going around, but very high fatalities in terms of soldiers. Is one the fact that it was actually going to be very hard to take Ukraine now, it seems, let alone try to hold it? So Russia and Putin does need an exit door.
No, not quite sure Putin is able to see the war in these terms. I think he still may suffer from wishful thinking and perhaps false information from his staff. But if he's able to see the war clearly, the fundamental problem on the Russian side is not just that the Russian military is losing, is that the war is perfectly counterproductive for Russia. The point of the war was to detach Ukraine from its military relationship with Europe and the United States. The opposite is happening. That relationship is deepening. And the point of the war for Putin was to demonstrate that Ukraine is a house of cards, that it's a fake government, it's a fake country, it's a fake state. And you've seen the opposite happening in recent weeks, where Ukrainians have been fighting valiantly for their country in the spirit of national unity. So if a war is perfectly counterproductive, you would have to assume that the right approach is to end the war and to finish it. But that, of course, for a person like Putin and for a country like Russia, having made this investment in the war, is not going to be easy to do. Not going to be easy psychologically, but it's a correct move policy-wise. So the question is whether they can sort of see the war in those terms and act accordingly, and will take a while, I suspect.
Now, finally, David Cameron, the former UK Prime Minister, wrote a diary for The Spectator recently where he recalled his own dealings with Vladimir Putin. And one of the things that he said he remembered most was how the Russian leader would ultimately take part in barefaced lying. So say we get to a point, whether it's in a few weeks, in a few months, perhaps in a few years' time, where there is an agreement, how do we know that the Russians are going to stick to it?
We don't. You could add to David Cameron's, I think, very persuasive interpretation of Putin's character, just the evidence that we have from the last couple of months. Putin repeatedly lied about the military buildup, that it was an exercise, that he was scaling back, that he was not going to invade Ukraine. All of the diplomacy that Putin engaged in before February 24th, when the war began, was duplicitous. It was a kind of political theater meant to convince the Ukrainians that Russia was not going to invade. So I think it's entirely plausible, perhaps even likely, that if Russia would sign a peace deal, or if Putin would sign a peace deal with Ukraine, that he could concoct a reason 3 months later to reinvade the country. So that is a crucial fact for Ukraine. Zelensky is not in any sense naive on that point, and that has to be factored in on the side of those who support Ukraine. It's not worth much, a deal with Russia. It might be worth something in the short term, as a sort of provisional stopgap solution for Ukraine, but a permanent solution or a permanent peace deal can only be achieved with a Russian leader other than Putin.
Thank you, Michael. Over the past few weeks in Westminster, the main issue has been Ukraine and the UK response to this. But now partygate is back. The Metropolitan Police have announced that they're issuing a first batch of fines. It's still unclear whether Boris Johnson will receive one and what exactly happens if he does. To find out, I'm joined by James Forsyth and Isabel Hardman to give us an update on the situation in Westminster. Isabel, this week partygate is back in the news after weeks where the focus has been very much on the situation in Ukraine. Can you bring us up to date on the fines that have been issued and what could follow?
Yes, so earlier this week the Metropolitan Police confirmed that 20 individuals are going to be fined as a result of the lockdown parties, but that their investigation is still ongoing because they have a huge amount of material to get through, which means that we have a lot longer to go in terms of the conclusion of this row and indeed the Sue Gray inquiry that's being run from the Cabinet Office into these parties and into the culture and the leadership that allowed them to happen. And so far we've had it confirmed by Boris Johnson's spokesman that he has not received a fine so far. And there has been some debate over whether Number 10 and Boris Johnson accept that laws were actually broken, which has left a lot of cabinet ministers having to go round the houses on what the Metropolitan Police have been fining people for if there wasn't law breaking going on. We've also had Keir Starmer renewing his calls for the Prime Minister to resign because he says he's misled the House over what happened in Downing Street, having previously said that all guidance was followed.
James, why would it be in Downing Street's interest to suggest that the law hasn't been broken despite the Met Police appearing to find that it has been?
I think, as Isabel said, it is slightly puzzling. The only one possible explanation is that there would still be at the moment time for people to contest these fines. So you could, maybe that is the reason. But it is very odd, especially when the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, had said that they had been on his morning broadcast round. But I think you do see, I thought it was very telling that Brandon Lewis last night went on the television to say that, Boris Johnson shouldn't resign even if he was fined, which I thought was I don't think we've heard that so directly from a cabinet minister on the record before.
And Isabel, where are Tory MPs on this? Because it does feel as though some of the heat has been taken out of partygate. The focus has moved to Ukraine. There's lots of Tory MPs saying there are bigger things to focus on. There's been some team bonding this week. Do you think that without a fine, Boris Johnson is safe, and perhaps even with a fine?
I think without a fine, he's safe. And I think that was probably just about the case before Christmas, when things were particularly intense, that there were probably enough Conservative MPs who in the end would have supported him in a vote of no confidence back then. As you say, things have changed quite a lot since then. The focus has shifted. But the focus has shifted not just onto Ukraine, where President Zelensky has made clear that he thinks the UK is helping more than most other countries, but onto something that is very difficult for the government, which is the cost of living crisis. And accusations, not just from the opposition, but from within the Conservative Party, and indeed suggestions from the Prime Minister that the government isn't yet doing enough to help people with the rising cost of living. And so you may well get a situation where MPs are very, very upset about how their constituents are struggling in the coming months. And then there's further fines from the Metropolitan Police and the conclusion of the Sue Gray investigation, where the Prime Minister may not be fined, but the sum total of everything else that comes out of those inquiries is really damaging for the Prime Minister and destabilises him again.
James, once again, I think the May local elections are being talked about as a judgment on the Prime Minister's leadership, on Boris Johnson. But Isabel just pointed out some of the other big issues in politics. And for example, cost of living, that is now seen in Downing Street as the number one issue for voters, well above concerns over parties. So if there are disappointing results in the local elections, do you think that Downing Street will be able to say this is due to general political problems rather than anything personally to do with Boris Johnson, or at least argue that?
I think Downing Street is getting ready to argue, but, look, bad results in London, you've known for some time that the capital is moving away from the Tories, they'll say. And I think you'll also see that kind of classic local elections expectation management game where the Tories will suggest that holding one councillor anywhere in the country would be a remarkably good result for a government in mid-term. So I think you can set aside all that. I think Isabel is right, though, that what is going to make politics so difficult over the next few months for the government is that people's real living standards will be going down, and that will make people unhappy. They will wonder why the government isn't doing more to help them, or why the government isn't steering a better course. And I think this is going to be very, very politically difficult for government, especially difficult for Boris Johnson, who is naturally a kind of good time politician. He is not, as we've seen, he doesn't like delivering bad news to people, and there's going to be an awful lot of bad news over the next few months. And I think one of the other factors of this is it does mean that the government is likely to go long. I think that an election before 2024 is becoming increasingly unlikely because the government will want to give as much time as possible for this inflation to kind of pass through the system before they go to the country.
Isabel, James talking there about how cost of living is difficult for Boris Johnson politically, but Rishi Sunak has not had an easy few weeks. And ultimately, does it help Boris Johnson, the fact that the candidate, the figure who is seen as the bookies' favourite to succeed Boris Johnson, the favourite in a Tory leadership contest, is actually seeing his star in the win?
Well, I suspect that the Treasury is probably feeling, the Treasury team around Rishi Sunak is probably feeling rather less superior to Boris Johnson than they were a few months ago. And I think now is the time for Rishi Sunak to show that he can be a normal chancellor as well. I think he'd got rather used to being a pandemic chancellor who could, as we've discussed before, put out graphics with him smiling into the middle distance and saying, we are, launching this massive furlough scheme, we are throwing money at this. He realised last week that actually pictures of him beaming next to a car that wasn't his, that he was filling up at a petrol station, didn't land very well, and that he needs to move to being the sort of more aloof, colder, more austere persona that most chancellors tend to create for themselves, because the job involves telling people that they can't have the money they want, whether that's government colleagues or whether that's households who are finding their living standards and their budgets being squeezed.
And James, when it comes to Labour's response on this, ultimately Keir Starmer is now calling again for Boris Johnson to resign. Do you think that it's going to have much impact, or is, as some of the polls are suggesting, the public losing interest when it comes to partygate and thinking there are bigger things to be talking about?
I think that Keir Starmer has waited a long time and not used some of the parliamentary devices he could have used when Boris Johnson was in the most trouble with his own side to cause Boris Johnson discomfort. I thought it was telling at Prime Minister's Questions yesterday that when this subject used to come up at PMQs, yes, there were some Tory MPs who offered kind of noisy vocal support to Boris Johnson, but a lot of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. While, as I thought yesterday at I thought on Wednesday at PMQs, they were much more kind of comfortable. There was much more comfort in kind of cheering Boris Johnson on from the Tory benches, which I think does suggest a slight mood shift there. I think, as you've written, Katie, there is a question about whether the mood shift in the public is as pronounced as the mood shift at Westminster on this question. But I think in some ways Keir Starmer, for tactical reasons, chose not to kind of ram home the advantage when Boris Johnson was in the most discomfort on this issue. And I think he is finding it now harder to get it going again. But some people would argue, and this is certainly the concern of some in the Tory party, that that Labour feel that this has taken a dent out of Boris Johnson, and therefore they are quite happy to have a kind of wounded. So this has taken a dent out of Boris Johnson, and in some ways for Labour that is job done.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Isabel. After a 2-year hiatus, is life finally getting back to its pre-pandemic normal? Richard Florida, a professor at the University of Toronto, writes in this week's magazine that cities are back and are better than ever. He joins the show now alongside the Spectator's business editor Martin Vander Weyer, who bucked the trend during lockdown and moved to the city. Richard, I speak to you from London, where I have to say it's pretty hard to get a seat on the tube at the moment. Reservations in, I think, what you describe as the good restaurants take perhaps weeks in terms of booking in advance. And it feels rather busy if you look at the various figures, including many members of the Spectator office standing outside pubs in Westminster. So are cities back?
I think so. And I think some are coming back. I haven't been to London in a while. I wish I was with you, actually. It's one of my absolute favorite cities. And in putting together my piece for the magazine, it was quite clear to me, looking at data on restaurant bookings, sports attendance, theater attendance, all of these things, housing prices, rents. London is back, and London is a big, tough city. I would say New York is coming back and coming back pretty quickly. I've spent a lot of time in the pandemic in Miami. Miami is fully back. Also people tell me Tel Aviv. I was just with some folks from Israel. Tel Aviv is full on. But then, you go to some cities like my hometown of Toronto. I was in Seattle recently. Cities that were hit hard in the first wave, and maybe they've been a little bit more tentative, they're far less back. And of course, as I mentioned in the piece, I mentioned this for London, where offices are coming back more quickly. But one of the things is that in the United States, if you look at our 10 biggest office markets, even though, I talk about this, everything city is back except for the office. People are going to restaurants, they're going to theater, they're going to sports, all of these things, going to movies, going to nightlife, but they're not going to the office, at least in the United States. On average, it's about a third. The office occupancy is about a third of what it was pre-pandemic. In some Texas cities, and if you had data on Miami, they don't really collect it, it'd be about half. But, New York and San Francisco are still about 25%. So I think one of the points that I try to make is everything city is back, save for one thing, people go into the office.
Martin, you bucked the trend during lockdown and moved from the countryside to the city, something you've spoken about previously on Spectator TV.
Yeah.
Do you agree with what we just heard in terms of the city being largely back minus offices?
Yeah. And everyone I talk to who's a sort of regular office dweller, as it were, they tell me they're back kind of half time in the office. I was on a webinar this morning with a group who were precisely that. And so that's the picture. And I agree with Richard. I think London is back. I've just walked across central London to come here this evening. I walked past a large queue outside, I think it's called Dishoom, a popular Indian restaurant. I mean, like 5:30 in the afternoon, there were 50 people queuing to get in. I sat outside in a courtyard in Covent Garden a little earlier this afternoon. There are lots of people around. It's lovely. And I think, Richard might comment on this, an advantage of old cities, European cities, I was in Paris also a few days ago, looked full of street life, is not being entirely built with a kind of downtown business district and a grid system of office blocks and so on that would be very hard to revive. I haven't been to Canary Wharf lately, which is the nearest thing to North America in architectural terms that we have, but I imagine that might still be a bit desolate. But old London, as it were, with its alleyways, its narrow streets and so on, is back, and in some ways it's better because there's a lot of life on the street, on pavement cafe life that we really didn't have before, and it's nothing to do with COVID. I think it's probably the fault of the mayor, Sadiq Khan, but there's actually quite a lot less unnecessary vehicle traffic nowadays. Who brings a private car into central London? No one does. So actually there's less traffic if you know where to walk. So I think, it's back and it's better. Yeah.
So I think you're spot on. And in fact, one of the things that got cut from the piece, because in a magazine piece you only had limited words, is the fact that one of the key elements of London's resiliency isn't its central business district or office district, these monocultures where we expected people. I say they're the last vestige of the industrial age, these ideas that you build these work-only communities, office districts where people commute 9 to 5 and it's desolate at night. What makes London a great city, it's a city of villages, it's a city of neighborhoods, it's an older city, and what I think is that's, I think I might have mentioned this in the piece. It might have gotten cut. Jane Jacobs, writing in 1958, before she wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities, which was published in 1961, her first big essay was called Downtown is for People. And she was making the point that these monolithic downtowns were outmoded then. And I think if we've learned one thing from the pandemic is that these single-use, monolithic, work-only downtowns don't work for many people. And you said it so nicely. When you came in, there was a queue in front of this restaurant or this cafe or this pub. I saw the same thing in New York City this summer when it initially reopened in July. Nobody was in the offices. The office towers were darkened. But there were queues around the block. And I think, part of this is my fault. When I wrote my book, Rise of the Creative Class, I said cities were about work, live, play. And I think the pandemic opened my eyes is that cities are about a lot more than work, live, play. And if I had to revise my own thinking, I would say it's not work, live, play. It's work, live, play, and then the bigger word, like I would make all capitals, connect. Work, live, play, connect. And I think what the pandemic is showing us is that great cities are not simply about containers for living or working. They're containers, they're mechanisms or platforms for human connection. And I think that's what you're seeing in London or New York or other great cities now.
And it's quite an interesting thing, which is that the city, that capital C, City of London, old financial district, I don't know if you're familiar with it, Richard, but that has actually been transitioning in this way now for at least a decade, that as the banks moved en masse down to Canary Wharf, when the investment houses moved up to Mayfair, the city turned into actually a bit of a nightlife district. And if you go down there late in the evening, you find, young clubbers, tottering along on their high heels, and there are burlesque clubs. There are all sorts of things you never have found a generation ago. So that, I think, is a positive transition. I just wonder how Canary Wharf will ever transition to anything else, or will it have to be sort of torn down and rebuilt in a more human scale and a more mixed economy?
Just on that, Martin, before we go to Richard, I just wondered, you spoke about how lots of companies right now do not have workers coming in 5 days a week. Do you think that this is something that is going to change? Perhaps we're not quite out of the pandemic yet and companies will return to 5 days a week? Or do you think this is a permanent shift to flexible working for the major companies in the city?
In some cases it may be. In some cases, employers, big companies, spotted the opportunity to economize on office space by saying, forever now, we're going to be a kind of hot desking model where you work from home at least 1 day a week and so on, and they'll cut some costs by doing that. Most business people I know recognize that there are these sort of advantages of human chemistry of bringing people back in. Most young people I know who live quite a way out are pretty sick of working from their bedrooms and so on. So I think it'll gradually mostly come back, but some businesses will keep it as a model with a 1 or 2 days a week out of the office as part of the deal, as it were. But what I'm guessing is, I'm guessing this, is that young people, particularly who are still largely working from home, love the opportunity to come up into town in the evening and have human contact and queue outside, Dishoom, the curry house, and so on. So that the nightlife isn't suffering that much from the working from home trend.
Yeah, I think the jury is still out on how much people will work from home. People are social animals, and Martin, you mentioned young people who are crammed and jammed into shared apartments need conviviality, they need connection, they need socializing, they want to meet people, they want to go on dates. So I think right now we're just coming out of the pandemic, and the survey data we have is just, I think, pessimistic. People are scared. They're not ready to go back to the office. They're scared. They're kind of feeling their way. They're going to a restaurant. They're going to a nightlife. So I think give it spring and summer and the warm weather, absent another wave. The second thing, and that you said quite aptly, is there has been an ongoing shift in what we call our central business districts. You see this in the financial district in New York City, which was rebuilt after the tragic attacks of 9/11. They have been adding residences. They've been adding condominiums. They've been adding hotels. They've been adding restaurants. They've been adding nightlife. And I think what the pandemic has done, it's accelerated this mixing and blurring. We used to have distinct places to live. We had distinct places to work. This is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution. And I think now with this new way of living and working and technology, that's blurring. And I think, it may be that places like Canary Wharf have to be rebuilt. But I guess the main point is that London has survived far worse than this. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist. And, my dad served in World War II. He was stationed in London. He stormed the beaches at Normandy. He told me this stuff. London survived the Blitz. London survived the Great Fire. London survived cholera. Great cities have survived far worse than this. And I think the one that I would rivet people's attention on, which is current day, which I think is far more far deeper than this one, is deindustrialization. When deindustrialization started in the 60s and 70s, people said places like London or New York or Boston could never survive. When the factories left town and the warehouses were abandoned, the cities would collapse. And of course, London and New York, and we can go down the list, transform those industrial districts, transform those warehouse districts, rebuilt those factory loft centers into art galleries, and ultimately that's where the tech companies want to be now. So it's just silly to think that an event like COVID would take London to its knees. London will adapt and change, and that's why we call cities our greatest, humankind's greatest creation, civilization's greatest creation, because they adapt and change, and that's what we're seeing now.
Well, I was just going to add to that, I suppose that's all true. Deindustrialization in London would be most visible in Docklands, the death of the docks as docks, and their recreation. That's been going on for 40 years now, and largely very successful. What I was going to say was an after effect of COVID generally is that people have an urge for fresh air. that meant initially people leaving the cities. Now, you tell us the trend is they may be coming back into the cities, but they still want the fresh air. And I think that's great, because I suspect what we'll get in the next wave of urban development is more green space, more tree planting, more appreciation of parks, more care for the small neighborhood green spaces. And I see that. I just had that thought this morning because I wandered down my street in Covent Garden. There's a new tree. It's an ornamental pear tree blossoming, and it's just been planted in the sidewalk. And I then emailed the head of our residents association, who leads a fight to make sure they don't completely privatize all the pavements by putting cafes on every pavement. And I said, if we've got to give way to more cafes on pavements, which on the whole I like, but not excessively, couldn't we ask for more trees? And actually, if we get a whole avenue of trees, it'll be ever more lovely. So I think there's a kind of fresh air in the city thing is going to happen in the next phase.
This is one thing that's surprising to me. The vaccines have been a miracle. Like, it's a miracle of medicine. And even these treatments, these antivirals, have been quite miraculous. But in many ways, an equal, if not more important way to deal with not just COVID, but all sorts of viral illnesses is ventilation. And it's not really talked about. If you look at previous pandemics, there have been changes in the built environment, open windows that would open, the invention of the modern powder room on the first floor where you took off your muddy boots and you washed your hand, and the usage of modern stainless steel and porcelain fixtures in bathrooms. These are all legacies of pandemics. No one has really talked about the changes in the built environment that we need. And I think you're spot on. It's ventilation. Fortunately, London has older buildings and older homes where the windows open. They're not sealed hermetically. But yeah, and moving things, and not just leisure activity, moving things like parts of schooling and office work or work outside into the fresh air or into ventilated environments. That's a big thing. And I haven't seen enough, it's a whole other essay, but I haven't seen enough conversation about that.
And just finally, Martin, we're talking about how office space, there could be a more permanent move, though it's still to be confirmed. What do you think is ultimately going to fill that if we do see, fewer offices already seeing some of that in terms of what place in cities, what will be there instead?
Well, there's a housing crisis, right? There's a great shortage in inner and outer London of the kind of studio 1-2 bedroom flat for the first time buyer, for the young professional, the young worker who has to commute into the centre of the city. So the obvious and logical development is a whole lot of redundant or vacant office space gets turned into small living units. Of course, extending that, it's nice to have more kind of entrepreneur hub spaces where people go sit designing apps and all that kind of stuff, But I think the first thing that should happen now is a sort of review of just how much office space is needed in each area. And if there's too much of it, there should be grant schemes, there should be all sorts of competitions for architects to come up with creative and livable ways of turning it into small units for basically young people, first-time buyers, renters, and so on. That would be a great transition. And if it happened, the street life in those areas would change accordingly, with the cafes, restaurants, shops, and everything that people want.
I talk about this in the piece, that one of the things London has been really good at is inventing these third places like cafes and bars and taverns. And I mentioned Lloyd's of London, and the London Stock Exchange coming out of Jonathan's Coffee House in the late 1600s. But right now, whether it's Soho Works, the co-working arm of the Soho House, or Second Home, Fora, Uncommon, I named these all in drafts of the piece. I went and looked at work life. You have created these kind of bespoke co-working. I don't even know what the right word for them is. Collaborative working, co-creating spaces. They're in almost every neighborhood now. And I think that's where we go. It's not the office as a cubicle farm where you plug in your laptop and sit there from 9 to 5. It's these new kinds of flexible spaces which blend hospitality and a club atmosphere and conviviality. The other thing is you're doing a darn good job of building, a good buddy of mine from Toronto, a young man named Ryan Prince, has a company called Uncle. An uncle in London is building these kind of smaller co-living spaces. And that's not the only one. There's quite a few of them. So I think this is a reinvention of a city in a way. I'm not sure. The one thing I'm not sure of is how much office space we're going to need to reconvert. And let me tell you, I have a good friend in Toronto who've been very much worried about this. And Toronto suffered through probably some of the greatest lockdowns. It has a very low space of office reentry. And he told me the other day, we're going to have to add a floor of office space. And I said, why? He said, yes, we have more people working remotely, but we hired so many people during the pandemic. If we want to make some semblance of space, even if they're hot desking and hoteling, we need to add more space. So many of these firms in big cities like Toronto or London or New York. And the other thing, of course, which I mentioned in the piece, if you look at who's really taking up space in London, it's not the finance, insurance, or real estate firms, the so-called FIRE. It's big tech. It's the Amazons, it's the Googles, it's the big tech companies that are taking increasing positions in the Londons and New York. So I'm not sure. We might end up net with more office space, although some of the older, more traditional cubicle farm offices may have to be reconverted, but we may end up at net with more office space in cities. I don't think we can predict that yet.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Martin. And finally, Spectator columnist Lionel Shriver writes this week that she's got a simple solution to rising energy prices, not turning on the heating in the first place. To give her best tips, Lionel joins the show now. Thank you for joining us today on Spectator TV, Lionel. Now, there's lots in the news about rising energy bills. It's only going to get worse. But in your column, you discuss that you've been ready for this for some time. Why is it that you prefer to have a cold home?
Well, I'm cheap. It's a little more complicated than that, in that about 10 or 11 years ago, we put in a wood stove, and I believed the installers who assured me that it would heat the whole house. Knowing what I know now, I feel like a complete mug. It barely heats the sitting room. And not very well at that. If you come up against the fire, it's great, but the whole point of having a whole house is to be able to go somewhere else but one tiny place. And therefore, instead of realizing that it was just one more expense in a middle-class lifestyle, in fact, a wood stove is a luxury item. It's not like being out on the frontier. I decided to go into denial and pretend that the stove was sufficient, and so we don't turn on the heating. I think that my most recent column in The Spectator will convince readers never to come to my house. Maybe that's its intention.
Yeah, I have to say, not that I have been invited, but the proposition has become a little bit less inviting since reading your column. What is the average temperature in your house then on any day of the week?
Well, this last winter it averaged about 11, but there was a cold snap in January, you may remember. I remember it more keenly than most people, because in our house it got down to 7. And that's the point at which I think the atmosphere qualifies as genuinely uncomfortable. And I have a routine during the winter of getting up and, I put on thermal underwear, top and bottom. I'm always wearing a wool jumper and heavy jeans. I wear knockoff Ugg boots and a scarf wrapped double round, and a little woolen black cap, and then I have an entire assortment of coats. They are not just little wraps; they are coats. And my current favorite is a fake shearling that has this huge collar that comes up. I look like a nut. When I go to the door, deliverymen look at me funny. And unless I decide to shiver through a Zoom interview, I look like a lunatic. Most of the time, I'm pretty warm. The most important thing that I've needed to master in just not turning on the heat at all, given what I do for a living, is typing in gloves. And this is especially important because I happen to have Raynaud's disease, which means that I have very poor circulation in my hands, and they get cold at perfectly ordinary temperatures. At 7 degrees, they're falling off my arms. And therefore searching out the right gloves in which you can type, touch type quickly without when they're being warm enough yet not so fat that they touch the wrong keys. I mean, I got a pair this winter that was really great. They were very toasty, but the little finger was too fat, and every time I typed a word, it would turn the caps lock on. It drove me nuts, so I had to wear thinner ones. I mean, this started out as an eccentricity. I kind of like the hardiness. I like rising to the challenge of getting through the winter without turning on the heat. But now, it's practice for the future. I mean, I wrote the column not just to, show off what a nut I am, but because this is the way a lot of people in Britain and even in Europe more generally are going to have to start living. Perhaps treating themselves to turning on the heat when it gets life-threatening, but otherwise resigning themselves that central heating is no longer affordable. It isn't. I mean, once the price cap goes up to close to £3,000 a year in the autumn, I don't understand how ordinary Britons are going to manage. I mean, taxes are considerable. If you live in a place like London, the cost of your housing is probably through the roof, and the median income is something like £27,500. I mean, where does the money come from? Food costs are also escalating fantastically. I don't see how Britons can pay that energy bill. It doesn't seem doable to me. Not without, not turning on the heat. It does have this kind of camping out quality, you're suffering adversity. I think that's one of the reasons that it appeals to me, because otherwise I'm completely spoiled. My life is not fraught with difficulty, so that I have to insert it. I have to go looking for it.
Now, as you say, I'm sure the Chancellor's going to come under more pressure. We expect there could be more offered when it comes to the autumn budget in terms of help for energy bills, but it's not going to deal with the cost of living crisis. People are still going to be really squeezed. So before we get on to your tips in terms of dealing with colder temperatures in your home, I wondered, how does your husband deal with all this? Is he on the same page as you? Has he been committed to keeping it low?
I think the short answer is no. And I think that's one of the things I wanted to warn readers about, is that this can be a source of considerable marital strife. My husband is not into it at all. He puts up with it in the same way he puts up with a lot of other weird things about me. But unlike some of the other weird things about me, I do not believe this is one of the things that he secretly loves. He hates it. And he doesn't understand why this late in our lives we have to suffer physically. He's a professional drummer, and when it gets really cold, he complains that, his hands are too cold and he can't play his instrument. And I nod understandingly, but that doesn't usually move me to switch on the boiler. And I think he's got a point. I think I'm being perverse. And I think I almost like the fact that energy bills are going up so much on my own account, not on yours, just because it seems to justify a policy that I have instituted with much more moderate prices.
If you go away, do you think that there's a chance he puts the heating on full whack and doesn't tell you?
You know, funnily enough, he would never do that. I don't know whether that speaks well for him or not. But he wouldn't generally take matters into his own hands. This is one of the things that we're all going to have to start managing, is these conflicts. People respond very differently to temperature extremes. Some people are much more bothered by it being too hot than being too cold. But there are others that are very, very bothered by a cold environment, which, you know, creates a sense of stintingness and adversity, and it's not hospitable. It's one of the reasons I have trouble getting people to come to dinner in our house. I mean, they arrive and they know ahead of time. Anyone who is still willing to come to dinner in our house arrives in these heavy coats, and they wear them all through dinner. And I don't blame them. I mean, I'm wearing something. I'm going to be wearing a warm wrap myself. So, that's the other thing, is I have this entire array of indoor coats for evening. You know, they generally below the knee, sometimes ankle length. And, you know, just think of the fashion opportunities.
So to conclude, Lionel, what are your top tips for viewers right now who are realising that they're going to have the heat on lower, perhaps a lot less in the coming months?
Well, most of all, just get used to wearing a lot more clothes. And if you can, encourage yourself to take a strange pleasure in denying British gas their windfall, then do so. A little bit of FU goes a long way in anyone's life. And it is satisfying to decide you're not going to be victimized. You're going to adapt. And it is possible, at least in especially southern England, to get through most winters without central heating. And I suggest just give it a go. Try rising to the challenge. By the way, you're going to have trouble with kids. They're not going to like it.
Thank you, Lionel. That's it for this week. Once again, a thanks to Canaccord Genuity Wealth Management for sponsoring the week in 60 minutes. Canaccord will provide the expertise you need to build your wealth and confidence. You can visit candowealth.com to find out more. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of the video and tap the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and do join us again next week.